into when we talk about real-time, high-quality critical care for mothers and newborn, how we can address this?
Sorry, missed the last one.
How we can address this? How we can strengthen this gap between
Right.
what's practice and what's actually reality?
Yeah, so I think there is enough global and national evidence of what works. We know what interventions work. I think all these decades we have spent a lot of time generating data and evidence as to what works and what doesn't. Clearly, for a newborn, for example, or maternal newborn, we know that maternal and newborn is one diet. Now, we know it's one diet, they are inseparable, and zero separation must happen. I'm just starting from a small example. But what lacks is implementation gap. The, the translation of this concept that there is zero separation is a must. Now look at that. In private sector, we see a baby is born through cesarean and the baby is kept often in the nursery. Why? We must ask, and as a public, we must, there must be a demand generation. There is an empowerment at the community and at the people's level required. You should start questioning. You should be empowered to ask, why is my baby not kept with me? Its pregnancy is a physiology, it's a normal, natural process, and the outcome, the baby that she has waited 9 months to have this beautiful outcome, why the baby must be separated at birth. The baby indeed needs to be on the skin of the mother, baby needs to have immediate and early breastfeeding started, irrespective of whether it's a cesarean. So we must all make noise and make sure that she must be able to be roomed in with the baby. So this is one example. So implementation is the biggest gap. We should no longer be just asking whether an intervention was done or not. Now is the time to ask, how was it delivered? Was it with dignity, with respectful care? What was the experience of care? Whether this is sustainable, whether the mother has been empowered to look after this baby even when she's discharged and at home. So continuity of care, sustainability of care, and her experience matters because that's how she gets trust into the system and into the people who deliver care. Thank you.
Experience matters. Dr. Surya company, in all supplementary care, as we talked about, what evidence-based interventions we have seen improving the survival outcome for mothers?
Okay, so that's a very important question, I think. And at the turn of this century and to the present day, we have seen a huge difference in the maternal mortality ratios. So, India especially has improved by more than 75%, whereas worldwide the improvement is around 40%. So, we have almost we are double the average of the world. So, today we stand at 88 according to the SRS data of 2022, which was published. We are standing at 88 maternal mortalities per lakh of the deliveries. And of course, the gap is still there, and we have to, make it much lower. Maybe the 20, something like 19 or 20, which is in the USA, and Kerala has already reached it. So it's not impossible. Our country has to reach it on the whole, and we are. I think the government has. Very good policies for the pregnant women and the neonatologist, I mean the neonate. So this has helped in reaching out to the pregnant women. We have many schemes and these are all helping. But besides that, to answer your question, yes, the evidence-based medicine is one very big, in the last 2 decades. It's something which has grown up on all of us as the clinicians. And today, at least in the tertiary care setups and in the medical colleges, this is what is the education which is being imparted, that this is the time to practice evidence-based care because it makes all the difference. And for critical care, if you say in my field, The two most common causes of maternal deaths today are the PPH, that is the postpartum hemorrhage, a severe bleeding after birth. It is still the number one cause of, unfortunately, the mortalities in our country, and it is preventable. Number two is sepsis, and third is the hypertension, like eclampsia. So these three are all preventable, and in the PPH we have got lot of evidence now. It is a bundle care approach. So not only can we prevent PPH by the active management of the third stage of labor, we can also, if the PPH occurs, how to manage it with a bundle approach. So a bundle is a group of interventions which, when you deliver simultaneously rather than sequentially, it has a much better outcome. So WHO and all the important bodies, the FIGO, they have all made these bundles as their standard care. So early recognition of deterioration, application of these bundle approaches, and timely escalation of treatment within the golden hour. So that is the other important thing. It's not that I can just take time to act. So I have to be very vigilant and act in that golden hour. Nowadays, golden hour is for all diseases, be it the heart attacks, we all know, stroke, in obstetrics also. So the golden hour is equally applicable. Rather, in PPH, it is the golden minutes because the patient can deteriorate very fast. So that's about that. Thank you.
Very valid point. Dr. Goyal, I'll come to you, and I want to talk a little bit about the high-risk pregnancies. So when we talk about these evidence-driven practices, what have you seen when we talk about these high-risk pregnancies? What sort of improvement we have seen in the outcomes of high-risk pregnancies when we talk about evidence-driven practices?
So at the outset, I would like to say that nowadays pregnancy is not the same as it was maybe 30-40 years ago. In India, almost 49.5% of the pregnancies are high risk. So you can see how important it is that we talk about high risk pregnancy. The biggest change, I think, is that we have started stratifying the women into low risk and high risk. Because the concept of high risk pregnancies actually came somewhere in the 90s. And since the time that we have started using those algorithms to identify women who are at low risk and high risk, that has made a big impact on the outcome for these women. The second, when we talk about high-risk pregnancies and improving the outcome, it can be prevention and it can be therapeutic. So I think preventive medicine has evolved. The continuous antenatal care that women are seeking, the supplements that we are giving. I remember when we were studying medicine, anemia was such a big problem. But now, since we have started routine supplementation with iron tablets, we are seeing a lot less of anemia. The other thing is the vaccination. The routine tetanus vaccines, and even now we've started giving influenza vaccine, that is preventing a lot of mortality among women. Then there are other preventive strategies like Dr. Jyotsna talked about eclampsia. So there is a term called preeclampsia. That means when you have high blood pressure and there is an organ failure along with that. So now we have preventive strategies for those. You start low dose aspirin before the 16 weeks of pregnancy. You will see a lot less of preeclampsia. So what has happened is the shift from absolutely therapeutic thing to a preventive strategy. I think that is the biggest game changer in high-risk pregnancy.
Dr. Sharon, a similar question to you. So ma'am talked about preventive strategies. So how early risk detection in preventive strategies? How can they can improve the outcomes?
So I think you are actually striking at the core pillars of maternal and neonatal outcomes and risk detection of risk and preventive strategies is the single most impactful entry point for any maternal health system, health protocol. So what we do at our in our practice is that for detecting the risk, how we go about it is that we suppose if there's a patient who comes, we do a good clinical checkup. We check the vitals, we check pulse, we check the blood pressure. We have talked about preeclampsia, eclampsia, blood pressure. We look for pallor and all these things. We also do certain like examination of the baby. We see if the growth is normal or not, and then we do investigations. We check hemoglobin. It is the most basic test. We check hemoglobin, we check blood group, we do a thalassemia screening, we do infection screening. So we try to detect anemia, hypertension, blood pressure. Sorry, it's the same thing. And we try to do any growth, fetal growth monitoring is also done. We have regular ultrasounds. We have the early ultrasounds that will try to detect any structural or any chromosomal defect in the fetuses so that women can have an early non-traumatic termination. And later on in pregnancy, we do a very good growth monitoring. So in that way, what we are doing that we are trying to stratify, as Dr. Goel just said, into high risk and low risk so that we can have timely reference. There are several prevention strategies that, as she also said, giving iron, folic acid, doing glucose, blood pressure, the sugar screening. We have a lot of diabetic patients, so putting them on MMTs and lifestyle screening, giving anti-D injections for RHI immunization, giving EcoSprint for blood pressure prevention. So these are the preventive strategies, and also vaccination. We are giving tetanus vaccination, we are giving flu vaccines. So these go a long way in preventing stillbirths and improving maternal outcomes.
Interesting. I'll come to you, ma'am, and wanted to touch upon the model of family-centered care, which kind of you pioneered. Uh, how involving families can improve the outcome for newborn care, and how this model can scale across India.
Okay, thank you. That's touching my favorite topic. It's close to my heart because I would like to educate the elite audience here that I think we need to move from a provider centered model of care, healthcare, to a patient centered model of healthcare. Now, what is it? Essentially, it's a very, very important paradigm shift. Traditionally, and for decades and ages old, we have been the provider, the healthcare provider, be it the doctor or the nurse, has been the center stage of providing care. And we did not much talk about the receiver of care, who's the patient. So, patient is an equal party. I mean, they are the equals, if not more, the stakeholders of receiving care. So, why were they not ever given so much due importance? So, now this paradigm shift that it's not about what doctor thinks about this illness, about this patient, it's also what the patient wants. Very often we realize that I remember my father was admitted. I'm sorry, moving for a second away from maternal and newborn because I want to really bring home the point that this is not just about family-centered care for a newborn. It's about patient-centered care in general. So it's a generic phenomenon. This paradigm shift needs to happen all over, cross-cutting across all specialities, be it medicine, orthopedics, or any other thing, medicine. So my father was admitted in a big corporate hospital. He was above 90 or something. He had multiple morbidities, which is so common at that age. And what would happen? The patient has been broken down into silos of different systems. A pulmonologist will come, look at his pulmonary condition, respiratory condition, write down his prescription and go. Nephrologist, kidney को आके देखेगा, उसका लेके चले जाएगा. Orthopedic surgeon will come and does not look at the patient as a whole. He just comes and says, okay, this patient needs surgery. For what? Because he had some old fracture, it's giving him pain now. He forgets to see the patient as a whole. Patient is very fit for surgery, he's almost terminal. So what will a surgery for back do at this time? So this multi-pharmacy, polypharmacy, specialist, I think it's broken down the patient. So what the patient needs, and that brings home to the point, the real need of a family physician who looks at patient as a whole and from patient's perspectives of what patients need. Now coming back to family-centered care for newborn, accordingly, so we developed that paradigm. We actually did this innovation which has been globally acknowledged. What we did was that our babies are admitted in the, I'm a neonatologist, so I look after sick and small newborn babies who are admitted in NICU, the neonatal intensive care unit. Neonate is a baby who is less than 28 days. And mostly we are dealing with babies who are preterms, 1 kilo, 1.5 kilo, while a normal baby is 3 kilo baby. So we are dealing with fragile, extremely vulnerable babies who are small and sick. So what is conventionally being done, and still at many places in corporate and many other places, what they do is, it is considered a prohibited area where parents are kept out in silo, waiting. They are merely visitors. They are allowed to see the patient baby, their own baby. Incidentally, their own baby, they can visit and see through sometimes the glass. Sometimes we get mothers in our outbound unit that mothers say they haven't seen their baby, for 6 days or 7 days. It's very common, and we need to break these kind of silos and these mindsets. So what we did, we said, and we were struggling with quality. We were struggling with how to deliver the best quality of care because the human resource, the healthcare staff is very short. The numbers are less, the work is more, quality suffers. And how do we do? There is a lot of things. See, imagine a nurse needs to change the diaper of a baby. We fortunately have diapers. Earlier it was just baby soiling the bed. So a baby wets the bed 10 times, 15 times in a day. So if the nurse is doing all these things, nurses feeding also, nurses to ensure the lines don't get swelled up, a lot of things have to be done besides these basic mundane things. And even cleaning, keeping the things. So it appears the baby is not getting the quality care. So I said, why not combat this human resource deficiency by actually involving the waiting parent outside? And what we started doing, we trained, we empowered, we involved the parents one-to-one. We started actually training them. We developed audio-visual training modules for parents, and we got them engaged, ensuring, of course, why do you think the parents have for decades been kept outside in a silo? Because of the fear that this will increase infection. But believe me, we did research, we showed, which is published, that infection did not increase. In fact, the breastfeeding rates improved, time to discharge decreased, the parent confidence and the trust in the system improved, babies got better quality of care, and the biggest advantage and the I would say the tangible, or I would say the fringe benefit was that these babies, these are the vulnerable babies when they get discharged. Mother normally would have said, oh, when you discharge the baby, she says, I'm scared to hold such a small baby. And now our moms, you know what they say? They say, yeah, I can look after this baby. She has a tremendous confidence, and she goes home, and we are rest assured this baby is safely going to be looked after at home. 20% of these vulnerable babies actually die at home. But now we know, and we have shown through evidence through community and public health research, we've actually shown this implementation in the community, in the districts and SNCUs, that actually the post-discharge mortality decreased, the survival improved, the quality of care improved, outcomes improved. And that's the magic of family-centered newborn care. So we developed this innovation. I just give you something which will touch your heart, certainly. One incident, small incident, that once we were rearing a small baby, 800 grams. Imagine, like a baby of a small size, a little bigger than the palm size. Such babies require 3 to 4 months of neonatal admission in the NICU. We were bringing up this baby. This baby was born to a 31-year-old mother and the parents who were conceived after 10, 11 years of infertility through IVF. And this baby was reared for about 3 months. Now the baby had come out of that acute sickness, was growing, and now was the time we shift this baby to the mother. Please don't take it otherwise that it was lack of care or anything. But let me tell you, this babies can flip flop. Anything can happen anytime. You can imagine a 1,200 gram baby. These things are not inevitable. So, as luck would have it, I told her that tomorrow we are planning to shift this baby with you in the ward. And then this is preparation for discharge so that she can go home when she's discharged and look after the baby. And as luck would have it, that very night, middle of the night, I get a call that this baby has aspirated and died, could not be revived. Just imagine 3 months, and this is such a precious baby for the parents. My God, I could sleep thereafter. And next morning, I go there, the body of the baby is still there, and the mother is standing sobbing away. I was in almost like shock and anger. And this doctor was there, and it was nobody's, I must say, it was not anybody's fault. These things do happen. So I was taking account from the doctor, called her, and probably the mother could read that we were having an exchange. I was angry. So mother comes up. Can you imagine? She hugs me tight, crying away, and saying, "Please don't say anything to the doctor. She's been working, and I've seen you people work for 3 months to get my baby where he was, and it's my bad luck. I have no such complaint. If I have my next baby, I'll come back to the same hospital, to RML hospital, to you." And that is the power of the trustful relationships of patient-centered care, family-centered care for newborn. And I'm proud. It really changed, gets a paradigm of quality into care. So this is family-centered care, and your second part, now I'll be very brief, I know I've taken a lot of time. So the next part was how do you scale it up from tertiary or from a big time hospital to a smaller primary healthcare setting and all that. We need to realize that this is not a special initiative. It has to become a culture of newborn care. It has to become a part of the health system, which means making infrastructure support for parents, for families, for making simple change in communication practices. You need to know that there's another person, receiver of care, who's equally a partner in care, a respectful, they need a respectful treatment, and maybe all these things. Basically, it's a healthcare provider mindset that needs to change. Nothing else. All it requires, no cost, zero cost, low technology, but still most difficult to implement because it requires behavior change. And most of the providers, the doctors, the nurses rather, to be more admissible and permissive to the parent being accepted as a partner in care and not as a simply passive receiver of care. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Thanks for explaining that in a very personal level. Dr. Suri, when we talk about public hospital settings, do you see it very difficult for these evidence-based practices to kind of get implemented on a community level?
Yeah, so thank you for that touching story, Dr. Maria. Yes, we understand that these things really do happen. Coming to your question, we are a very busy hospital, probably the largest number of deliveries in the whole northern India, I suppose. At least in Delhi, we are the leading. And having, say, 80 deliveries per day or so, it, theoretically, you may say, are you able to deliver the evidence-based care? But yes, I can proudly say that we can. Why? Because we are blessed to have a large number of postgraduate students, 30 per year we have. So 90 postgraduate students, large number of resident doctors, huge faculty. So we are getting all the resources. The human care, of course, the limiting factor is the space. Space is a limiting factor for us, but it's being overcome with the maternal child health block, which is being set up shortly. But yes, in a medical college, the evidence-based medicine is being practiced. But however, having said that, it is not uniform across the country. There are a lot of challenges. The biggest being, the overload over the tertiary centers. We need to strengthen our peripheries where the deliveries are taking place and good seamless referral system. So those are very, very crucial if we want to, have the good evidence-based medicine to be practiced uniformly. Another thing which I would like to say is that during a time of stress, there is a cognitive overload over the mind. So people forget, okay, there is a bundle, I have to do these 5 interventions, but I can forget. So how do we remember it? How do my students remember it? It is by practice. And how to practice? It is the simulation and the drills. So in all important emergencies, we are having the regular drills, PPH drill, eclampsia drill, maternal collapse drill. And when my students do those drills and they face the real life experience, believe me, the action is different. Repeating the drill every month, and then when unfortunately they see the situation, they can manage it. So CBMB curriculum for the postgraduates and undergraduates by MNC is now applicable all over our country, and the simulation-based teaching, skill-based teaching is now essential. So those are the important things which I feel, making checklists, keeping them on the website, simulations, regular listing, and a seamless referral from the periphery